Okay, so this is part two of population and community ecology. So we talked a little bit last time about R and K strategists and survivorship curves. And we're going to start off looking at just meta populations. So a group of spatially distinct populations that are connected by occasional movement of individuals between them. So good example of meta populations, the idea of the spotted owl, we've looked at that already. If you look at spotted owl populations in Washington state, the sort of olive green areas, these are meta populations of spotted owls. Forest habitat that's suitable, old growth, particularly large trees. And so you have spotted owl populations that may move between these different areas on the map, but not very often. Wild dogs in South Africa, another good example of meta populations. You look at the meta population reserves of wild dogs, they exist in distinct regions. Another example would be sage grouse. So here in Colorado, you have distinct populations of sage grouse that don't often travel between the different blue areas on the map, once in a great while. And you can look at, with some detail using things like eBird for sightings of sage grouse and realize that, in this part of Montana, you're just really not going to encounter the sage grouse or because of the habitat differences. Sky islands in the desert Southwest, particularly in Arizona, are good examples of where you can see meta populations. So you have low areas in the desert Southwest that are dominated by desert, the desert biome or desert habitat. But then when you get up into these mountains all around Arizona, Southern California, New Mexico, even Utah, you get at high elevation, you're going to run into coniferous forest. And so what you get are these what are called sky islands, these habitat fragments or patches of forest that, in between these, really you have desert floor, low areas. And so when you look at black bears in, Arizona, this is Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca in southern Arizona, the map of this whole state, you have these sky islands that are suitable for black bears, but they really don't travel too often in the low areas across the desert. So you have distinct meta populations of black bears. Okay, competition. So the struggle for individuals to obtain different limiting resources. So we always have competition in nature, and that limits, where you're going to find organisms. You can think of this in a bacteria colony in petri dishes. If you have one species with optimal conditions, it'll do really well. Another separate species of bacteria, P. caudatum, does really well, all grown all by itself. But when you grow the two together, you'll see competition, and one species will outcompete the other. So P. aurelia outcompetes P. caudatum in this case. Okay, and we can look at that competition with three species of bacteria. Again, all grown separately. They all do well on their own. But then when you grow caudatum and aurelia together, caudatum in this case does not do well, but aurelia does well. And then here, caudatum will outcompete bursaria when they're grown in the same context. And so then that brings us to this idea of resource partitioning. So, do species diverge over time, or they tend to, where there's area where they compete directly? And so the idea of the law of competitive exclusion, no two species are going to occupy the same niche and compete for the same resources in the same habitat for very long. And so again, where there's overlap, over time, species are going to tend to evolve away from that competitive zone. And you have different types of resource partitioning. You have temporal, where, wolves and coyotes may be exploiting similar food resources, but they're separated, or they've evolved to separate their competition because wolves are more day active in their hunting and coyotes are more nocturnal or night active in their hunting patterns. So temporal or time-based partitioning of the resource. You have spatial partitioning and morphological resource partitioning as well. Spatial use of different types of or portions of the habitat. And so warblers may take advantage of different portions of a tree, upper branches or lower branches, depending on the species. Of certain, maybe some warblers are more inclined to feed on the interior portions of a tree. Plants can do resource partitioning. You can have plants that have extremely deep root systems and others with more shallow root systems to partition the use of soil resources. Again, different shorebirds or species of birds that feed in the intertidal zone or on sandy beaches have beaks that are adapted with different beak or bill lengths. And so things like godwits and dowitchers are a longer billed species, and they can exploit food resources deeper in the sandy nearshore habitat, whereas like least and western sandpipers, shorter beaks, they're only going to be able to exploit food near the surface. Okay, predation. So with predation, you're using one species as a resource by another species. True predators are going to actually kill their prey. You have herbivores that consume plants as prey. And you have parasites, of course, that live on the organism or inside the organism that they're consuming. Of course, and finally, parasitoids are going to lay their eggs inside other organisms. And then typically the larvae will hatch out and use that organism as a food resource. You have predator-mediated coexistence of prey species. And so what that means is you've got a predator here, in this case, this small owl species, pygmy owl, and they are going to prevent competitive dominance of one species over the other. So they may be feeding on a particular species and sort of let the other species that they're not feeding on wind up competing in a way that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. Okay, so relationships between species here. So mutualism, of course, it's an interspecific interaction between two species, and both species obtain a benefit from that interaction. And so we, often think of ants as being mutualistic in their relationship with different tropical tree species. Ants will obtain nectar or honeydew, as it's called, from tropical plants. And in exchange, as sort of a bargain there, the ants will provide protection to the tree species and help the tree avoid predation, the leaves or herbivory of the leaves by other species of insects. Okay, commensalism is a relationship where one species obtains a benefit and the other species is not really harmed or helped. And so that is a relationship as well. The idea of keystone species. So when we look at the concept of keystone, here's a keystone here on this archway. Without this keystone, the archway doesn't really have any structural integrity or strength. And so you need this, right? And you think of keystone species as a species that's really integral to the ecosystem. Beavers are a good example. They have a really important role. They may not be that many of them, but they have an outsized role in the overall picture of the ecosystem. And we looked at this with wolves. When we looked at how wolves change rivers, they're considered to be a keystone species in many different ecosystems. Okay, primary succession. So, when you have, we're jumping around here, but a new concept, when you have a disturbance that comes through like ice age or a glacier, that'll cause an entire, depopulation of all the plant and animal species in the area. And actually, the glacier may remove all of the topsoil as well. And so you're just left with bedrock. So primary succession is where you have the reestablishment of plant and animal communities over time after a disturbance that removes all of the soil, all the plants and all of the soil. So initially, you're going to just have exposed rocks, and eventually, you have the lichens and small algae and mosses come in, maybe some annual weeds, some grasses and shrubs, ultimately small tree species. And given enough time, you'll get to this sort of climax forest community, which is kind of the ideal state for that ecosystem. Secondary succession is similar, but the disturbance didn't remove the topsoil. So the soil remains intact, and secondary succession typically happens a little bit more quickly in that case. So you can have these climax communities on different ecosystems. You know, coral reefs are considered a climax community. Here's a climax community in the desert. So it's not always, forest ecosystems that we're talking about. And of course, you can have aquatic succession where you may have a pond that gradually over time fills up with sediment and accumulating decaying plant and animal material and may ultimately become a meadow. You also have, just in the course of a year, you have seasonal succession that can happen where you have an explosion of a plant phytoplankton community in the ocean, large growth of diatoms, and then they sort of die out and are replaced by green algae. And then those sort of decline, and maybe a blue-green algae dominates for a period. And that when that declines, maybe the diatoms reemerge as so. There's succession that can happen on an annual basis. Okay, and we're in the home stretch here. So factors that determine species richness, things like latitude, how close the area is to the equator, time between disturbances, and the total habitat size. And so we've looked at, definitely equatorial regions are higher in biodiversity. And the final idea here related to this is the theory of island biogeography, first proposed by Edward Wilson and a colleague of his, MacArthur. And so they looked at islands off the coast of Panama, and they found that the larger the size of the island, the greater number of bird species that would be found on that island. And so they came up with this theory, island biogeography. They incorporated a distance effect. So the farther the island is from the mainland, the fewer species that would be able to colonize that island. So distance, and then also size. And so you have this relationship. Large islands have greater number of species, and islands that are further away from the mainland have smaller number of species. And so island biogeography, distribution of species related to size and distance from the mainland. So you look at herpetofauna, right? Herps, reptiles, basically, and the island size in square kilometers here on the X, and the number of species on the Y. And so as the island size increases, you have more diversity. So again, herpetofauna, reptiles, amphibians, that kind of thing. And this shows up in the Sky Islands as well, of desert Southwest Arizona and the like, those areas. So as those size of those Sky Islands increases, the larger contiguous forested patches tend to have higher species or numbers of species of mammals.